The moment he stepped into the classroom, he felt something was off. The usual chatter of students filled the air, but there was an uneasy energy hanging over the room. He couldn't put his finger on it until he looked up. His feet froze. His breath caught in his throat. Across the room, a boy sat at a desk, talking to another student. The sunlight from the window hit his face at an angle, highlighting something that made his stomach churn. It was him. No, that wasn't possible. His mind had to be playing tricks on him. But the boy turned his head at the same moment, and their eyes locked. His own face stared back at him. The noise in the classroom dimmed. He couldn't hear anything. His pulse pounded in his ears. The other boy's expression mirrored his, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, frozen in disbelief. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. The whole world seemed to shrink into this one moment. Then the whispers started. Whoa, are they twins? Wait, what? That's insane. They look exactly the same. A girl near him gasped, covering her mouth. No way. That's creepy. He took a step back, his legs suddenly unsteady. He glanced around the room, expecting someone to jump up and yell that this was some elaborate joke. Maybe a new student who just happened to look like him? But no, this wasn't a passing resemblance. This boy was his reflection. Even the teacher looked confused. She frowned, adjusting her glasses as she looked from one to the other. What's going on here? Her voice cut through the murmurs. Neither of them spoke. They just kept staring at each other, as if speaking would shatter reality. He felt his fingers twitch. His hands were sweaty. His heart pounded. Something wasn't right. The other boy finally swallowed hard and muttered, "Who are you?" The question hit him like a punch to the chest. He barely knew what to say, because he was wondering the same thing. Who was this boy? Why did he look exactly like him? And why did it feel like, in that single moment, his entire life had just changed forever? The rest of the school day felt like a dream, one that didn't make sense, no matter how many times he tried to process it. Every time he looked up, his eyes landed on the boy who looked exactly like him. And every time, the same wave of confusion and disbelief crashed over him. At first, he thought it was just a weird trick of the mind. Maybe a distant relative he had never met. But that didn't explain the exact same features, the same eyes, the same nose, even the same birthmark on his wrist. Whispers followed them all day. Are they twins? Did their parents separate them or something? This is like one of those crazy stories from the news. The other boy, his duplicate, had been just as shaken. They kept glancing at each other, as if one of them would disappear if they blinked too long. By lunchtime, the curiosity was unbearable. He took a deep breath and approached the other boy's table. Their classmates watched like they were about to witness something unbelievable. His voice sounded strange, even to himself. We need to talk. The other boy nodded quickly. Yeah. We do. They stepped aside, away from the noisy cafeteria, and sat across from each other at an empty table. Up close, the resemblance was even more unsettling. Their movements were the same, blinking at the same time, tilting their heads at the same angle. It was like looking in a mirror that breathed. I don't understand this, the other boy finally said. Me neither, he admitted. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, he asked, when's your birthday? The other boy hesitated. April 14th. His stomach flipped. That was his birthday too. He forced a swallow. Where were you born? Hillcrest Hospital. He felt a chill run down his spine. That was the exact hospital he was born in. The other boy must have seen his reaction, because his face paled. Wait, you too? He could only nod. His hands clenched into fists, his mind racing. What was going on? Before he could ask the next question, a shadow fell over them. It was a teacher. Boys, are you okay? They quickly nodded, neither of them willing to explain this impossible moment. As the teacher walked away, the other boy hesitated, then said, "We need to ask our parents." His chest tightened. His mother. For the first time, fear crept into his thoughts. If this was some insane coincidence, why did he suddenly feel like she had been keeping a secret from him his whole life? And if she had, then what was it? What had she never told him? The ride home felt longer than usual. His mind was a storm, replaying every detail of the day. The boy who looked exactly like him. The same birthday. The same hospital. It couldn't be a coincidence. Something was wrong. He barely noticed when the school bus stopped in front of his house. His legs moved on their own as he stepped off, his thoughts tangled in confusion and anxiety. By the time he reached the front door, his hands were sweaty. Would his mom even know anything? Or would she be just as shocked as he was? He stepped inside. "Hey, sweetheart. How was school?" His mom's voice rang from the kitchen. She sounded cheerful, as if nothing had changed. He hesitated. His heart pounded. Then, before he could stop himself, the words tumbled out. "Mom, I think I found my twin today." Silence. For a second, he thought she hadn't heard him. But then he saw it, the way her body stiffened. She turned slowly, a wooden spoon in her hand, her face frozen in place. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. His stomach dropped. Something about her reaction told him that she knew something. "Mom?" He stepped closer, his pulse racing. "Did you hear what I said?" She blinked rapidly, forcing a smile. That's crazy, honey." "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly that." He pulled out his phone and opened the picture he had taken at school. "This is him." She stared at the screen. Then, her face went pale. He had never seen his mom look so shaken. Her hand trembled slightly as she lowered the spoon onto the counter. "This isn't possible," she whispered. His chest tightened. "So you recognize him?" "No. I mean," she shook her head rapidly. "This can't be happening." He frowned. "Mom, what's going on?" She looked away, pressing a hand to her forehead. "I need to sit down." The air in the room changed. It felt heavier, like a secret had been locked away for years and was suddenly clawing its way out. His mom slowly sank onto the couch, rubbing her temples. "Tell me everything," she said quietly. So he did. He told her about how he met the other boy, their matching birthdays, the same hospital, the whispers from classmates, the strange gut feeling that something wasn't right. When he finished, his mom was silent. Then she let out a shaky breath and whispered, "Oh my God." His stomach churned. "Mom, just tell me. Do I have a twin?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. "But I think I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago." His heart stopped. Something was wrong. And whatever she was about to say was going to change everything. His mother's words hung in the air like a thundercloud, heavy and full of something he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. His chest tightened. "Mom, just tell me. Please." She pressed a hand to her forehead, breathing in deeply, before looking at him, really looking at him. Her eyes were glassy, filled with something between regret and sorrow. "I never thought I'd have to talk about this," she murmured. His pulse pounded. "Talk about what?" She hesitated for a long moment before whispering, "You weren't born alone." The words sent a chill through his body. "What do you mean?" His voice barely came out. She swallowed hard. "There was another baby." A sharp breath left his lungs. "Another baby?" She nodded, gripping the arm of the couch as if she needed something to hold on to. "When I gave birth, there were two of you." He felt his stomach drop. The world around him blurred for a second. A twin. He had a twin. The thought was so big, so overwhelming, he could barely hold on to it. His whole life, he had been an only child. No siblings, no family members his age. But now, in one moment, everything had changed. What happened? His voice shook. Where is he? His mother's expression twisted into something almost painful. That's the thing, she whispered. I don't know. He felt his pulse throb in his ears. You don't know, he repeated. Tears welled in her eyes. When I gave birth, the doctors told me that one of you didn't make it. He sucked in a sharp breath. They said he was stillborn, she continued, her voice breaking. I never even got to hold him. They told me he was gone. His mind reeled. But if that's true, then... His mother wiped at her eyes and let out a shaky breath. Then who is the boy you saw today? Silence filled the room. A deep, suffocating silence. His heart pounded so loudly it almost drowned out his thoughts. None of this made sense. How could his twin be alive? How could an entire human being, his brother, have been taken from him without anyone knowing? His mother buried her face in her hands. Oh God, what if he was never gone? His mouth went dry. The weight of the truth pressed down on his chest. The hospital. The records. The missing pieces of his past. Someone had lied. Someone had taken his brother. And now, after all these years, the truth was finally coming back to light. The walls of the living room felt like they were closing in. His mother sat on the couch, hands shaking, eyes wide with disbelief. He stood there, numb, trying to process what she had just said. A twin. A twin who was supposed to be gone. But he wasn't gone. He was alive. And he had spent years walking around, breathing, growing up in a different home, without them ever knowing. His voice came out hoarse. Mom, if he was taken from us, then who took him? His mother's face twisted in pain. I don't know, she whispered. I never questioned it. I was broken. When they told me he was gone, I believed them. He felt his stomach tighten. Did you ever see him? Even once? She shook her head, wiping at her face. They told me not to. They said it was better if I didn't. His blood ran cold. That wasn't normal. Something was wrong. And he wasn't going to let it stay buried any longer. He pulled out his phone. I need to know the truth. His mother sniffled. What are you doing? I'm looking up my birth records. His fingers trembled as he searched for the hospital's website. If there were two of us, there should be some kind of record. Something that proves he was really. He hesitated. What word was he supposed to use? Dead? Missing? Stolen? The thought sent a chill down his spine. His mother wiped her eyes and leaned forward, suddenly urgent. If there's something I missed, I need to know too. Together, they started searching. They looked up birth records, hospital reports, anything that could give them a clue. But the deeper they went, the stranger it got. His birth certificate didn't mention anything about a twin. The hospital's records showed his mother had given birth to only one child. No mention of complications. No stillborn report. Nothing. His heart pounded. This doesn't make sense. His mother's breath came out in a shaky whisper. It's like he was erased. A cold fear gripped his chest. Or like someone didn't want us to find him. He didn't know who. He didn't know why. But someone had taken his twin. And after all these years, he was going to find out the truth. He could barely sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his own face staring back at him, the face of his twin, the brother he never knew existed. His mind raced with questions. Who took him? Why? And the biggest question of all, did his twin know? By morning, he had made up his mind. He wasn't going to sit around waiting for answers. He was going to get them. His mother looked exhausted as she sat at the kitchen table, her coffee untouched. Dark circles rested under her eyes, but when he told her his plan, she didn't argue. "We start with the hospital," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions in her eyes. He nodded. It was time. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and old memories. He had been here before, of course, every time he got sick, every time his mom had a checkup. But now it felt different. It felt like stepping into a past someone had tried to bury. They approached the records office. His mother took a deep breath and spoke to the clerk behind the glass. "I gave birth here 16 years ago," she said. "To twins. But something doesn't add up. I need my full medical records from that day." The woman behind the counter frowned. "Twins?" She typed something into her computer, then shook her head. "Our records show only one birth under your name." His mother's hands clenched. "That's not possible." The woman hesitated. Then, lowering her voice, she said, "You might want to check with the archives department. Some of our older records aren't in the digital system." His stomach tightened. Someone had tried to hide this. They were sent to a small, dusty office down the hall. A man in his 60s greeted them with tired eyes. When they explained the situation, he frowned but nodded. "We keep physical records for cases like this," he said, stepping into the back. Minutes passed. Then, finally, the man returned, holding an old, yellowed folder. He placed it on the desk and flipped it open. His mother's name was there. The date matched. His birth record was listed, but beneath it, something was crossed out. The man squinted. "Strange," he murmured. "There's a second entry here, but someone tried to remove it." His heart pounded. The man grabbed a sheet of thin paper and placed it over the record, rubbing a pencil across it. Slowly, the erased name began to appear. The name of his twin. His mother gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. Then the man's face paled. "Oh no," he muttered. "What?" his mother demanded. He turned the folder around so they could see. There, in faded ink, was a note written in the margin. A single sentence. "Transferred to private adoption, per Dr. Reynolds' request." Silence fell over the room. His mother's breath came in shallow gasps. "I never approved an adoption," she whispered. His fingers curled into fists. His vision blurred with anger. Someone had taken his brother. And now they had a name. Dr. Reynolds. Whoever he was, whatever he had done, he was the reason their family had been torn apart. And now, after 16 years, it was time to find him. The name burned in his mind like a brand, Dr. Reynolds. The man who had stolen his twin. The man who had ripped his family apart without them ever knowing. He and his mother didn't waste time. They dug through every record they could find. Dr. Reynolds had been a high-ranking doctor at the hospital, until he suddenly retired over a decade ago. There were no signs of where he had gone. No listed address. Nothing. It was like he had vanished. But they weren't giving up. After hours of searching, his mother finally gasped. She had found something, an old article about a private adoption agency Dr. Reynolds had been involved with. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Adoption fraud. Doctors selling newborns to wealthy families. Covering it up with fake records. Taking babies from mothers who never agreed to give them up. His chest tightened. This wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was a crime. And now, after all these years, they were about to uncover the truth. The address they found led them to a quiet, upscale neighborhood. It was hard to believe that behind these perfect houses, behind the trimmed hedges and expensive cars, there was a secret hidden for years. His mother knocked on the door, her hands trembling. A minute passed. Then another. Finally, the door creaked open. An older man stood in the doorway. White hair. Sharp eyes. He had the look of someone who had lived too comfortably for too long. Dr. Reynolds? His mother's voice was tight with emotion. The man's eyes flickered with something, recognition, maybe, or fear. Then he shook his head. I think you have the wrong house. His mother stepped forward, her jaw tight. You took my son. A flash of something crossed the doctor's face. He opened his mouth, then closed it. I don't know what you're talking about, he said quickly. Too quickly. His stomach twisted with rage. You stole my brother, he growled. The man's expression darkened. He started to close the door. But his mother pushed forward. Where is he? She demanded. You had no right, to take him from me. Dr. Reynolds sighed. He looked tired. And then, in a low voice, he said, you should leave this alone. A chill ran through him. His mother's face twisted with anger. I will never leave this alone. Not until I get my son back. Dr. Reynolds studied them for a long moment. Then, finally, he stepped aside. Fine, he muttered. Come in. Inside, the house smelled of old books and polished wood. The doctor led them to his study, where he sat behind a large desk, rubbing his temples. There are things you don't understand, he muttered. Then explain them, his mother snapped. Dr. Reynolds let out a slow breath. Your son, he wasn't supposed to be taken. It was a mistake. His blood boiled. A mistake? He echoed. You stole him. The doctor didn't deny it. He just looked tired. It was complicated. There was a mix-up in records. Your son was labeled as an orphan. He was placed in the adoption system before anyone realized the mistake. His mother's hands clenched. And you never fixed it? Dr. Reynolds hesitated. Then, with a sigh, he said, the people who adopted him, they were powerful. Wealthy. They didn't want to give him back. His breath caught. His brother had been sold to a rich family. The doctor leaned forward. I know where he is, he said quietly. His mother's breath hitched. But listen to me, Dr. Reynolds continued. He doesn't know the truth. He doesn't know he was taken. As far as he's concerned, he's lived a normal life. He's happy. His jaw tightened. So what? He growled. We're just supposed to let this go? Dr. Reynolds met his eyes. If you tell him, you'll ruin his entire world. Silence. A cold, suffocating silence. Because for the first time, he realized this wasn't just about finding his brother. It was about whether or not his brother even wanted to be found. His mother sat frozen, her breath shallow, her fingers curled into fists on her lap. He could feel the weight of her emotions, rage, sorrow, disbelief. It was the same storm that churned inside him. Dr. Reynolds had just confirmed what they feared. His twin had been stolen. Sold. Raised by strangers. And now, after 16 years, they had a choice. Tell him the truth and shatter the only world he had ever known. Or walk away, leaving the past buried forever. His hands clenched. How could they walk away? His mother's voice came out hoarse. Where is he? Dr. Reynolds hesitated. His fingers tapped the edge of his desk, his face unreadable. Finally, he exhaled. He lives with his adoptive parents in Eastwood Heights. Eastwood Heights. His breath caught. That was only 2 towns away. His twin had been so close this whole time. His mother sucked in a shaky breath. Do they know? She asked. His parents. Do they know he was taken from me? Dr. Reynolds hesitated. Then, quietly, he said, they knew. His mother's face twisted in pain. She pressed a hand to her mouth, choking back a sob. It was like another betrayal on top of everything else. She had spent years grieving, believing her baby was gone, while another family raised him in comfort and privilege. And they had known the whole time. How do we do this? His voice came out rough. Do we just show up at their house? Do we tell him? His mother lifted her head. Her eyes were red, but there was a fire in them now. I want my son back. Dr. Reynolds shook his head. It's not that simple. His mother let out a sharp, bitter laugh. It was simple when you took him, wasn't it? Dr. Reynolds didn't respond. His pulse pounded. He imagined it, knocking on the door of a stranger's house. Seeing his brother's face again. Telling him, hey, your whole life is a lie. It felt wrong. But wasn't it more wrong to let this continue? He turned to his mother. If we tell him, and he chooses to stay with them, can you live with that? She flinched. Her lips parted, but no words came. That was the real question. It wasn't just about finding him. It was about what happened after. His mother's hands trembled. Finally, she whispered, I don't know. The truth was, neither did he. But one way or another, they were about to find out. The car ride to Eastwood Heights was silent. His mother gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. He sat beside her, staring out the window, his stomach twisted into knots. They were minutes away from seeing his twin again. The brother he had never met. A brother who had no idea they even existed. His heart pounded as his mother pulled into the long driveway of a large house. It wasn't a mansion, but it was nice, too nice. A house that belonged to a family that had money, that had security, that had given his brother a life he never got to have. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then his mother exhaled sharply and stepped out of the car. He followed, his legs shaky. As they reached the door, she hesitated, then knocked. A long pause. Then the door opened. And there he was. His mirror image. The same face. The same eyes. The same stunned expression. For a moment, everything felt frozen. Then his twin frowned. Wait, what? His breath caught. What could he even say? Before he could answer, footsteps echoed behind his twin. A woman, his adoptive mother. Her face paled. Her eyes darted between them, her lips parting in shock. She knew. His mother's voice trembled. We need to talk. They sat in the living room. His mother explained everything. The truth. The hospital. The doctor. The lie that had kept them apart for 16 years. His twin sat motionless, his hands gripping his knees. His adoptive mother kept shaking her head, whispering, we thought we were saving him, we didn't know the whole story. His mother's voice broke. He was mine, she said. You took him from me. Tension filled the air. His twin finally turned to him. His eyes were glassy, full of confusion and pain. This is insane, he murmured. I don't even know you. The words hurt. But how could they not? He had lived a completely different life. A life where his mother didn't exist. Where he didn't exist. And now, in the span of a single conversation, his entire world had been shattered. The hours passed. Words were exchanged. Tears were shed. But in the end, the truth couldn't be undone. His twin knew now. And now, he had a choice. I need time, his twin finally said. His voice was hoarse, exhausted. I don't know how to process this. His mother's eyes filled with pain, but she nodded. I understand. And she did. Because this wasn't about taking him back. It was about giving him the choice that had been stolen from him. Days passed. Then weeks. His twin didn't call. His mother cried at night, but she never pushed. He needs time, she would whisper. He deserves that. And then, one evening, the phone rang. His mother answered, and after a long pause, tears filled her eyes. She turned to him, barely able to speak. It's him, she whispered. He wants to meet again. His breath hitched. His twin had made his choice. Not to erase the past. But to build something new. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.